Hello and good morning. My name is Mark Hamzat Arabogbo. I am chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Special Interest Group with the FENG, the Financial Executives Networking Group, one of the largest finance executives groups in the world. We have about 40,000 members. If you are not a member, please reach out to myself and we can help you with that process. Today, we will be presenting a talk on climate change featuring Germán Ibanez, Dr. Gavin Dillingham, Dr. Michael Shaddai, and Dr. Lou Liu. And folks, if you can introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Germán, and then we'll be going to our presentations, followed by Q&A. And we encourage folks to ask the experts questions. You have 4 experts here, so this is going to be as conversational as possible once we get through the slides. Germán.
My name is Germán Ibanez, FEM member, and I have development experience in the power industry for the last 20 years, both internationally and domestically, and also been doing for the last 5 years some environmental work with the city of Houston and other organizations here in town. Gavin?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Gavin Dillingham. I'm with the Houston Advanced Research Center, and I direct the clean energy work there. And that's HARC is a research institute founded just north of Houston, Texas there. Secondly, I lead the Pythias Analytics climate program or organization, and co-founded that a year ago with Lou, who's on the call with us, as well as a couple other esteemed colleagues. And our primary focus here is really helping the energy sector better understand physical climate risk and how to take appropriate actions and make decisions to mitigate that risk. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Hello, everybody. This is Michael Shaddai. I'm the CEO of Ignite. I have been working in power generation, oil and gas, and chemicals industry for the past 30 years. I have been, specifically for the past 10 years, I have been working on effects of climate change on power generation, to be specific, and to oil and gas and the product distribution.
Hi everyone, my name is Lou Liu. I worked with Gavin on water, energy, and climate related projects for a couple of years, and then I recently joined the Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering Department at Iowa State University as assistant professor. My research interests are in the impact of climate change on water resources, water, energy, climate nexus, and the sustainability of urban water system.
Excellent, thank you. And if we can begin, Dr. Michael, thank you.
So the presentation, after the introduction, I will start with problems. Germán will go, will work and will say more on the problem. And then Gavin and Dr. Liu will be working on the solution to these problems. And at the end, we have a question and answers and discussions area. So the consequences of climate change. As the temperature increases, the consequences of climate change worsen. One of the reasons, as you see in this slide, is as the temperatures are rising, the amount of moisture that is being held in air increases, and that moisture increase will cause a lot of storms, category 4, category 5 storms, because now the air has a lot more momentum and can, cause a lot more harm. Higher temperatures also increases methane production. The methane production that is being released on the earth are the result of the organic decomposition that is caused by overproduction of the bacteria. This happens both in the landfills and the oceans. So it's not only something that is happening on the land. The oceans are producing a lot of methane. Again, that is caused by decomposition of organic material. For your information, methane is actually 23 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So what are the other consequences? This extreme weather actually alters the distribution of and redistribution of the fresh water. And, you know, we are facing a lot of droughts and a lot of floods lately. This increased number of floods in one area actually causes the droughts in other areas. And that has a very high risk, especially in power generation and in oil and gas industry. And, you know, not only in the production side, but also in the consumption side. We can see that happening in California right now. So one of the other consequences of this climate change is its effect on power generation. Most of our power generation are done through steam generation and combined cycle power generation. And so because the plants need water to produce electricity and the water needs to be replenished on a daily basis, this water scarcity that is caused by the extreme weather threatens the power generation. And that has not only the generation part, but also has effects on the distribution side. Herman?
Sure. I'm going to change the screen change. So hold on just a second. So due to the conditions that Dr. Michael has talked about, we've had a major effect on the power on commercial effects, $1.1 trillion over the last 15 years, thanks to NOAA. And the map here shows all the places that have been affected by weather. Of course, we have the fires on the West Coast, but here in Texas, we've had extreme weather. February with Winter Storm Uri. We've had hurricanes, droughts, and extreme weather, flooding, and water availability issues. So this shows the different things in separate maps. So you've got droughts and heat issues here. You've got winter storms. You've got tropical cyclones. You've got local storms. You have wildfires and you have flooding. Since a lot of our folks on the panel have been in Texas, we wanted to focus on Texas because Texas has all of the effects on it. And wanted to show you, this is a map or a graph from 1980 to today. And notice that in the last 10 years, we've had an increase of these multiple disasters and storms in Texas. So Texas overall is being affected more than any other place in the United States. So it's also affecting rating agencies. If you don't have a climate action plan and you're a city, you are actually going to be starting to get dinged on your credit ratings for your bonds. Regulatory issues. If you looked at a 10K recently, there are sections on the risk factors that they actually want you to talk about climate change. Investors are looking into making sure that you have that too. The emergence of the ESGs and that factor in especially in the power industry, I think is becoming more prevalent. And then finally, with insurance, with Winter Storm Uri, there was a supposedly ERCOT had an insurance policy, and that insurance policy, because they didn't do what was recommended in 2011, they chose not to pay out on the claim that ERCOT put in for February. So you really need to start looking at this, and it's affecting you not only from the investor viewpoint, but from the regulatory viewpoint as well. So Gavin, I'll leave it on to you.
So I'll unmute myself as I start talking. So yeah, thank you, Herman. So we kind of been talking a lot about the risks that are out there, and a lot of there's some significant risks that we're seeing, especially in the power sector and the energy systems. But we also want to indicate that, you know, there's time, and it is still very important to really kind of figure out how do you become climate ready, and how do you focus on those opportunities that are out there. And a lot of discussions are happening with the Securities Exchange Commission, with the Federal Reserve Bank, that's really trying to better understand how do you disclose this risk, how do you become more transparent and aware and assess these risks. And by doing that, you get a better understanding of, you know, what do you need to do with your investment and divestment decisions? How can you make better, more informed financial investment decisions there? How do you improve your return on investment for asset and system upgrades by taking into account the physical climate risk that we have just talked about, as well as forthcoming transition risk, regulatory risk, and market risk and such. And so a lot of the things as we talk with different organizations, especially in the energy sector, is really helping them kind of find that those operational and strategic changes that need to happen to allow them to be more competitive under different future climate conditions and climate scenarios. So really kind of having this, you know, climate ready focused strategic planning is very important to really ensure that, you know, your assets and that your business decisions are in line with, once again, the forthcoming regulatory changes that we're seeing, as well as the physical climate risk changes that we're seeing. Next slide. We've really been trying to get a better understanding of how organizations look at climate risk and how they think through climate risk. And we actually had a survey in the field over the last month or so, where we're talking to those that are in with the work on scenario planning, who do operational planning, who look at kind of that, what does the future strategy look like for an organization? And so, you know, folks across across these energy organizations that have key decision-making abilities. And we're really finding that there's a desire to start looking more at climate risk, but there's a lot of question as far as how you can use this data and how you can integrate it into your decision-making models, into your scenario planning and such. And so, see, these are some of the initial kind of findings we've had through the survey, as well as just talking one-on-one with these different organizations to get a better understanding and feel for what they're thinking about. Once again, it seems like there is growing discussion. You see a lot of this in the media, a lot of talk about potential stress testing. They're doing it in the Bank of London or Bank of England, stress testing regarding climate assets that's being considered over in the United States. How does that consider to play, you know, in your decision making going forward, as far as how climate's going to impact your overall operations there? Next one. So I wanted to go into just some solutions that we're considering and that we suggest that organizations start looking into to really, you know, be ready for what's coming. We were already seeing, as Herman pointed to, that the $1 trillion in damage that's happened in the last, in the last year, and that just continues to happen. And a lot of that, you know, when we kind of look at, Herman mentioned that we were focusing on Texas in some of our work. And the reason for that is when you looked at those 22 events that Herman had up, that NOAA identified as $1 billion+ events, 11 of those happened in Texas. And so it's real significant risks, especially along coastal communities, for climate impacts, impacting the communities, impacting infrastructure, economies, et cetera here. And so really important to start looking at solutions. And if we go to the next slide, we want to really kind of indicate that, that there's some good information out there to get those climate analytics, to get that good source of data, that the scenario, or to get the information, essentially start making those decision making. So really working on modeling the transition and physical climate risk. So the transitional risk is, when we're looking at decarbonizing the energy infrastructure, what impacts that has. And that's been in the news quite a bit. When you look at, for example, was it engine company number one getting board members on the ExxonMobil board there? That was largely focused on transition of in a decarbonizing market, and how Exxon needs to take better, more proactive steps in that regard. But we really, once again, think the physical climate risk is also very key and important, and the data is available and is out there, and we try to work with organizations to make sure they have access to that. And one of the things we really try to point out is there's some really good models out there. And then there's also some folks that are, pushing information that's not high quality or not great. And so it's really important to be able to differentiate where the good models are and where the not so great ones are. And so when you look at, physical climate risk, you can talk about precipitation, temperature, sea level rise. Those are three kind of the strongest areas there where the models are much more robust and can give you really good ideas and insight as you look at your analytics, look at climate risk indicators, and start running different types of scenarios around that. If we go to the next slide, one of the things that we really recommend that organizations start focusing on is when they're doing strategic management or strategic planning and looking at their scenarios, really take into account both the physical and the transitional risk, and what are the financial implications that are associated with that. And looking at physical risk, that's both the longer impacts as far as, or longer duration type events such as drought, versus the more chronic, quickly happening types of events such as flooding. And then also take into account what are the policy changes that we're seeing, what are the technology changes that are happening, and how is that going to impact the overall value of an organization over time. And when you're looking at those, the physical hazards and the transition shocks, what is the exposure that an organization has to that? What's its sensitivity and what's its adaptive capacity? And that's one of the things we've been looking at Pythias Analytics, is helping companies understand what their adaptive capacity is. How well can they respond? How prepared are it? And how can they take the appropriate action to mitigate that type of risk? So scenarios are very important, and we see a greater push by rating agencies, by central banks, by insurance companies to have organizations run more scenarios that take into account physical and transition climate risk. And there is an organization, a global organization called TCFD, the Task Force for Financial Climate Disclosure, that is out there, that is putting together essentially the standards to ensure that there's a standard for disclosing and assessing climate risk, both transition and physical climate risk. And that's being tied to SASB there, to ensure that our accounting also is following specific climate and physical and transitional risks as well, and taking that into account. And so once again, there's a greater pressure for organizations to really start running these scenarios and taking into account both physical and transitional risk. Next slide. For the next two slides, we're going to have Dr. Liu come in, and this is some of the research she's been working on that really gives you a better idea as far as what's happening specific to the power space there. So go ahead, Liu.
Okay, thank you. So so this is a paper we did a couple years ago. So I just give you a really high overview of this paper. Basically, what we did is we built a power generation system model for the United States, and we couple it with an Earth system model, which produces the air temperature, water temperature, and the stream flow data. Because the power generation, as Mike mentioned earlier, is constrained by the availability of water and the temperature of water, as well as some regulatory constraints. So in the United States, the threshold for discharged effluent from power plant is usually around 32 degrees Celsius, which is about 89 degrees Fahrenheit. But the standard actually varies from state to state. And there are cases where you can obtain provisional variances where you could discharge water hotter than the threshold to maintain your operation. So what we did is looking at the combined impact of a climate change and regulatory constraints on the power generation. And in this figure, what we're showing that if we have a limited water supply for the power system, how might the energy system adapt to a limited water supply? The top figure, what the top figure shows is that under severe water constraint in 2050, we are going to have forced retirement of existing power generation. And the underlying color, the red color, shows the economic cost associated with this forced retirement. The reason we are having this forced retirement is because some old fleets are no longer economically viable to maintain because they use a lot of water, and under a severe water constraint scenario, it is no longer economic viable to maintain operating them. We would rather install new capacities that use much less water, such as solar and wind and natural gas, and retire these old capacities that use a lot of water. So you can see that there are several states that stand out on this map. We have Texas, California, Arizona, and Florida that have the highest economic cost associated with the forced retirement. And the yellow circles on top of the map, it shows the cumulative forced retirement capacity in gigawatts. So that gives you an idea of how much of the forced retirement that is. This bottom chart shows the two different water constraint scenario. The first one is current water availability, which means that we just maintain the current amount of water supply to the electricity generation sector. And the other one is severe water constraint scenario, where we assume that only 50% of the current water is available to the electricity generation sector. So as you can see that when water is binding, we would have a lot of forced retirement from the gas and coal fired technologies, and these are usually water intensive technologies. So it's kind of expected that they are forced to retire under water constraint. So so this study, the key takeaway from this study is that the energy planners need to think ahead and act proactively to consider the future drought conditions into their energy system planning, because failure to do so will have a toll on their power assets. So if you go to the next slide. Okay, so this one takes a look at the impact of climate change and the regulatory constraint on usable power capacity of the power system. So usable capacity means the maximum power generation of a power plant can produce under specific conditions. So if you are familiar with the RCP scenarios, so these are representative concentration pathway scenarios, which shows you how the future climate might look like. So RCP 4.5 is a moderate temperature increase scenario where you would expect a 2.5 to 3 degrees of temperature increase from the pre-industrial level by the year 2100. And RCP 8.5 is a more aggressive scenario. Usually we call that business as usual scenario, where the temperature increase is around 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. So what this shows is we projected the usable capacity reduction compared to the historical level for year 2030s, 2060s, and 2090s under these different climate change scenarios. If you compare the red and the blue bars, you would see that under a more warmer climate, we would have more reduction of usable capacity. And this is expected because with higher temperature increase, the water will get warmer and you have less water available. So therefore the power plant has to dial back and comply. If you look at the darker red and the darker blue, these are scenarios in which we assume that power plants were given provisional variances where they could continue to operate even they exceed the temperature threshold. So if we were to relax the regulatory part, then we would have less reduction in usable capacity, but still you would have some reduction. And this is the pure impact of climate change. So you see that with combined impact of climate change and regulatory constraint, you would have 10 to 15% of reduction from historical level. And if we were to relax the regulatory constraint a little bit, then we would still have around less than 5% of reduction. And this is purely the effect of climate change.
All right, so thank you very much, Lou. And this is just one example of some work that we looked to, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but we were looking specifically at natural gas plants in Texas and using a water model and combined with the energy or water data combined with our energy model, able to really start identifying trends in which power plants had to start, curtailing power or essentially shutting off. And what this slide is actually showing is the number of days within each one of these years over time that we see power plants potentially having to curtail, which means a decrease in revenue because they're not able to produce as much power, or potentially shut off completely because once again of water availability issues, or the water outflow coming from these plants is too warm for what's permitted for them to release from their plant. And so it's just, once again, what we try to do is help organizations and help improve understanding as far as when is this likely to happen? What are the, how do we start putting some estimates around the likelihood of these events, and how do you start taking action on this type of real data? And so when you're looking at water models, temperature models, sea level rise models, you can start really kind of putting likelihood estimates around these, putting your probability distributions around this, and get a better understanding of when you actually anticipate these events happening over a life of an asset, and allows you to prepare for that type of scenario there. So just one of the examples we just recently did, just kind of continues with Lou's effort there. Some of the other stuff that's just really important for organizations to be thinking about is just kind of that strategy planning. There's a lot of good data out there. There's a lot of good modeling that's being done out there. There's regulatory pressure, there's market pressure to get this done. And so it's just, once again, incorporating this information with your scenarios and starting making sure this is part of your strategic management process, your strategic planning process, your enterprise risk management. And then it starts getting incorporated, because you can either start to do it proactively now, or wait for the SEC to start requiring it, or wait for regulators to start requiring it, or the rating agencies to get a little harder pushing down on it. Or you can get really good at it now. So it's kind of that choice there of, when do you want to decide to do this? You want to be told when to do it, or you want to actually start taking these actions and starting to assess your risk there. So next one there, Herman. What we try to look at when we talk with organizations is really kind of work through a real specific process. It's a really engaging type effort. And so when you're working with organizations that you're talking to about, helping you understand what your climate risk looks like, or running through these different types of scenarios, it has to be a very much an engaging type process where there's an interaction that's happening, where they're getting an understanding, they're interviewing your key people within the organization, they're learning what the physical risks are that happened in the past, what has disrupted your supply chain in the past, what has turned down these power plants in the past, what has essentially been those extreme weather events that have been impactful. And then working from there and understanding, okay, I now understand what events have caused negative circumstances, which has caused disruptions in business operations, decreased revenue. So what do those risks look like in the future? And then starting to gather the appropriate climate data for that, starting to running the appropriate scenarios to better understand, okay, I know I'm susceptible to these types of risks that's happened in the past. What is the likelihood of them happening in the future, and how do I start preparing for them? And so it's just really important to start thinking through that entire process and making sure there's a really good relationship and strong engagement between your operators, your planners, across the organization. This isn't just something that can happen in a silo. It has to be kind of an organization-wide type discussion that has to happen there. So next one. And this is just an example that we pulled out for a power utility that we've worked with, or that we've been working with, and really just kind of pointing out, these are some of the key areas you can really be focusing on. When you get outside of some of these areas, water availability, temperature, coastal flooding, sea level rise, and you have someone maybe talking to you about, well, we can tell you about tornadoes or hailstorms, or those kind of major convection storm events, wind events. Or if you're in the wind power industry and they're saying we can help you with wind velocity and wind direction, that's really not where the models are these days. They're really focused on, they're really good at the sea level rise stuff, the temperature, the precipitation, and that's where they're the most robust. And so we just wanted to indicate that it's easy to kind of say we can do all things and we can assess all climate risks, but there's really, some really strong, robust models out there. Dr. Liu pointed to a few that she's working on, and hers were focused largely on precipitation and temperature, and that's just where kind of the science is these days. So just important as you start working in this area, going down this road assessing climate risk, that you understand that there's some models that are really robust, and others that people may try to work with you on that just aren't as strong and aren't as robust as the others. So I want to just kind of point out that this is kind of the scope we try to look at when we're talking with organizations. And so Herman's pushing me along here. This is some of the folks that are on our Pythias Analytics team. We have just some great scientists. Lou, of course, mentioned here, but we have across universities, Lehigh University, University of Houston, and Carlos Gamara, who's here at HARC with us, just really kind of helping build these robust models and making sure that there's good quality climate data available and real strong opportunities to do robust scenario planning for organizations. So I believe that's everything, and now we're going to be open for Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you for your presentations, folks. And I want to encourage people to get in the chat and to share your information. This is not a dead forum. We want people to interact. We want to provide solutions, and so we've got I know a few folks in the audience, obviously. Please share your information so that people can connect with you. We're all here to work together and provide solutions to some of the things that they talked about. So go ahead and do that. So, all right. So for my first question, can we describe climate risk analytics, what it is and what the difference is between transition and physical climate risk?
You want me to take that, or?
Yeah, so go ahead, Gavin, you can start, and then.
And so as far as I can, I'll speak specifically to the difference between transition and physical climate risk. So transition risk has been in the news a bit longer than discussions around physical climate risk. And transition risks looking at the decarbonization of our power system. So if you're an energy company and you're an oil and gas company, there's the looking at, okay, so what happens if there's regulations such as a carbon tax that impacts our ability to bring this product to market, or reduces the value of that product, or leads to potentially stranded assets. And so that's the kind of the concern around transition risk, though, is that movement to a decarbonized market where there's less consumption of oil and gas. On the physical climate risk, that's focused very much on extreme weather events, whether those are chronic events or acute events, from droughts to flooding events to hurricanes, sea level rise, extreme heat. All those have impacts on supply chain. They have impact on business operations, on manufacturing, on infrastructure. And so the physical climate risk is very much that extreme weather risk that we're starting to see there. So that's largely the difference between the two.
Superb. Gary Crispins, you had a question. If you don't mind unmuting yourself and asking the panel the question regarding carbon credits.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, I hear all this stuff about carbon credits where companies are buying them and some these companies are selling them and then they get credit. And, I never have understood who produces these credits, how are they produced, what are they actually buying, and are they just buying something to get out of some regulatory requirement?
Well, I can answer that one. Essentially, there are markets that are created by regulatory mandate, and it's done by the state, and not necessarily on the power side. It can be done by the state, or it could be done by ISO, but it actually is done by the state. And essentially, you can buy credits. There are permanent ones and there are temporary credits. And so, for example, Metro buys credits, even though they have some hydro and some electronic buses in their fleet. They buy carbon credits to make up the difference, to say that they're compliant with their policy. An expert and a friend of mine that's on the call, Charles Nunu, can talk a little bit more about where you can buy those credits and brokers that we have in Houston to do that. Charlie, do you want to speak up?
Please do, Charles. And yeah, we really want this next session to be conversational. Don't be shy. If you haven't had your coffee, go ahead and.
Charles is never shy.
No, but I may not be the right person to ask. There are absolutely effective rules on the state, and I think, Herman, good morning, everybody. First and foremost, hope everybody is well. There is no question that in the 8-county area for Houston, Galveston, call it the Harris, Galveston, Fort Bend, surrounding counties, the state program for reducing NOx VOCs, HRVOCs, has been extraordinarily successful. Stationary sources, to the point around power plants and chemical plants and the petrochemical plants across this whole area, only in 2002, 2004, were 73% of the polluting entities inside the 8-county area. In the arc of 10 years, we dropped it almost down to 25%. The mobile sources, however, have gone and replaced the 75% of the polluting issues in this 8-county area. And so when people talk about the carbon credits, I've always had this problem that people don't want to do the material balances around what carbon credits actually are doing. To a large degree, credits are supposed to give you an incentive to become more efficient or to address some external event that's causing problems in health or air quality, et cetera. But carbon becomes a little more difficult because A, because it doesn't have boundaries, and B, because we don't have a state or federal regulatory system, they're often very, very mushy. And so what you actually buy doesn't give you the incentive to actually do the reductions or the efficiencies inside the plant, which is the only thing that's materially important. So I'm not a big advocate of carbon credits, even though Richard Sandor and I have gone back on this for a long time. It drives attention to that marketplace, but what really needs to happen is a price on carbon so that you can get some even playing field around the people who are efficient doing their job and also contribute something back to society. But if you want to know about who to talk to, I'm happy to do that. But I've never been a big carbon credit advocate because it really does boil down to revenue minus expenses. If you're efficient, you should be reducing your carbon footprint automatically by energy consumption or something else.
Charles, can you share your information in the chat, please? And Dr. Michael, you look like you might have something to add to that. And then if there's any other experts in the audience, please speak up also.
So part of the carbon credit was designed not only for the energy efficiency increases in the plants, but also to be able to help offset what the plants are producing. What I mean is that there are companies that they are specialized in carbon capture. And by capturing the carbon and sequestering it either under the ground or utilizing other methods like grow houses in order to transform those carbon back into oxygen and return it back. So they are creating what's so-called a carbon credit. And that carbon credit can be purchased by some companies. So this was part of it was designed in order to offset the costs of the companies that they are doing the carbon capture either through planting trees in or grow houses and or by the chemical means of carbon capture.
All right, I'd like to finish up my discussion. So there are 3 areas in the United States that are actually doing carbon, putting prices on carbon. You've got California, and you have RGGI, which is an assortment of states on the East Coast that include Virginia now. And then finally, New York is actually in the process of creating their pricing. So there are regional areas that are doing carbon pricing. There's also a national organization or multiple national organizations that are trying to push through a carbon pricing thing on the federal level. And so there are attempts to try to get this to put actual carbon pricing on emissions at the wellhead or at the stack to try to help with the efficiencies. So I think we've done this one to death, so we can go to the next question.
Solomon, if you can speak up and ask your question, please, that you put in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So my question was more about data and kind of sourcing data, what data sets and vendors you're using, and then kind of what big deficits you're seeing to help kind of do these predictions that maybe we should all as a group start looking for, or trying to solve together, including like alternative data. It can even be weird, obscure, like, oh, let's look at shipping routes and things like that. And, you know, satellite imagery sources, Spire, things like that.
Does anyone, either from the panel or go ahead, Herman?
So Gavin, do you want to do that, or do you want me to put up the slide with all the data sources? What do you want to do?
And put up that slide, and
Okay.
I think Lou, if Lou can connect in too, she would be a good person on that as well. But if you put up
All
that,
right. Just 1 second.
And
Lou,
then a related question, if someone can explain the difference between carbon price and carbon tax.
I'll answer that question. So carbon credits are traded on the no, that's not that one. Are traded on exchanges, and the ones in taxes are done via regulatory means, and so that's the major difference. And so, and I finally got the slide that I was looking for. Hold on.
And then our follow-up question, or next question after we answer that one, is why should companies start considering climate risk in their management and strategy decisions? If you want to go ahead and answer that next, Gavin, whilst we pull up the slide.
Well, there's a variety of reasons for why companies need to be starting to look at it. First of all, we're starting to see physical climate risk already taking significant or having significant impact on organizations, impacting the supply chain, impacting business disruptions, causing organizations to potentially have to move to other locations because of the continued increase in disruptions that are happening with climate risk. The rating agencies are very much putting pressure in this regard. Moody's came out recently that expected a $270 billion devaluation of assets on a yearly basis, just specific to physical climate risk. And so rating agencies are very much paying attention and aware of these risks and see a significant impact on value of companies based on that. The other reasons around, you see what regulators are doing right now. This Securities Exchange Commission just finished a request for testimony on how should climate disclosure and climate assessment be provided in security filings. Right now, there is an expectation that in 10Ks and SEC 10Ks that there is a mention of climate risk. If what's this, potentially a material climate risk impacts to operations and to finances. SEC is looking to put a better, kind of make that a bit more of a robust reporting requirement and better define what materiality looks like. Insurance companies are reducing or are not insuring or reducing their willingness to insure assets and operations in certain parts of the globe. One issue that we've seen out in West Texas is insurance companies are limiting their insuring of solar power plants due to convection storms and due to hail. And so there's all those different areas there essentially starting to place pressure, increasing pressure on organizations to start taking some action to better assess and look at what their climate risks and what their adaptive capacity, what steps are they going to take to mitigate risk. And so those are some of the reasons why it's important to really start thinking about this, because you're either going to get in front of the curve or you're going to be told and required to do it. And so sometimes it's better to be a little more proactive and make sure you understand what's going on and be part of the conversation versus being told what you need to be doing around this space.
Excellent, thank you. And then if you wanted to, Herman, if you wanted to touch on the data sets briefly.
Or maybe you want Lou to kind of cover that. Lou, are you on still? So you popped in and out.
Yes, I dropped the line for a few minutes. What was the question again?
So the question is largely about what are some of the good data sets and kind of essentially data sets, indicators that people should be looking at. And so of course this is some of the stuff that we're looking at, but your input on what models and data sets that people may want to be considering.
Oh, okay. Did you produce this table here?
Yeah, that was from, remember our technical study we did a while back with Hongyi.
Okay, so I recognize some of the names here. So I just say what I know. So for the climate data, we have the CMIP 6 data available right now. This is the most up-to-date, state-of-the-art climate data produced by the IPCC. And we have I think over 20 global climate models that produce this data. And many scientists are working on them to downscale the global climate models to regional level so that the data can be more useful to the regional planners. And the other one I noticed here is the Mozart model, which is a model developed by one of our team members, Hongyi Li. He's an assistant professor at the University of Houston. So this model could produce historical and a future projection of water temperature and stream flow availability for the entire United States. And this data would be very useful for planners to look at how much water would be available at their site and what the temperature might be like. And this data is highly has a high granularity, and I believe it is at the daily time step from historical year up to the year 2100. And the other model I noticed here is the GCAM model. So this is an integrated assessment model. So what an integrated assessment model is, it is a model that studies the coupled human and the natural system dynamics. It's a very useful model to look at how the human system might respond, how human system might respond to different energy policy and climate change scenarios. So with this model, we could potentially answer questions like how might the energy system adapt to a carbon tax, a tax on carbon or carbon credit, and how the energy trading would look like under different national or international and energy policy scenario. And what else do I see here? So I'm not familiar with the other model that you have here. So Gavin, maybe you can take it from here.
Yeah, not a problem. Those are some of our other energy models that we put together. And Lou, are you familiar with the WRF, the WRF model? Do you see that as being useful as people looking at climate data?
I think that's a weather forecasting
right.
model. Yeah, that's I think that model drives the one of the Mozart model. That's that provides the input data for Mozart.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And there's also some great data out there with NOAA, the National Ocean Atmospheric Administration. They've done some really good work on sea level rise and storm surge. There's also the Department of Interior has a really nice, robust wildfire database. And, and that's, the wildfire piece, there's a lot of work that's being done there by looking at drought conditions, but that gets fairly complex. But you look at drought conditions, you also have to look at the makeup of the forest or the environment that you're dealing with and how much fuel has been developed within those areas. But the Department of Energy has been doing some good work in that space to make sure we have a better understanding of wildfire. Looks like there's also, which one is it, Lou? The climate assessment, the National Climate Assessment, NCA4, is that the right one? Am I thinking the right one? That's for more of has kind of a regional breakdown of climate risks and kind of climate data across the United States. So the National Climate Assessment, it came out a couple years ago, and they do that every few years to make sure that that data is available as well. But as Lou mentioned, one of the most prime sources is what's called the CMIP6 data, and that's the most recent and latest global climate data that's now being downscaled to more regional, local type uses there. So hopefully that was helpful.
Excellent, thank you. And so what are the limitations, or actually what should companies be aware of or cautious of when looking at different climate analytics solutions?
Yeah, I can start on this, and if anyone else wants to jump in as well. As I was mentioning earlier, there's some models that are, and some data sets that are very robust. And so when we look at the water models, such as this Mozart model that's mentioned here, the precipitation water models are very robust. There's a lot of agreement across climate scientists that water precipitation models are very robust. The temperature models also are very robust. When you're looking at extreme heat, when you're looking at heat waves, when you're looking at heating degree days, cooling degree days, those types of models are very robust. The sea level rise models are very good. Those have a lot of agreement, and a lot of people are widely used. The hurricane models are getting better. There's still a lot of questions on some of the variability. The expectation is that the intensity of storms are going to grow, and that's because of warmer ocean temperatures and just warmer water in the atmosphere. But there's also, some question as far as how many are actually, are we going to see an increasing number or a decreasing number? And, I think as the CMIP6 data comes out, we're going to have a better understanding with that, because there's been some disagreement as far as the total number of hurricanes. The expectation, though, and it's largely agreed, that the intensity of hurricanes, so more Category 4, Category 5 type hurricanes versus 2 and 3. Wildfire risk, wildfire data, wildfire models are pretty robust, and that's because they're largely based to temperature and precipitation models, and so those are very strong. I think when you start looking once again at convection storms, so major, thunderstorms, tornadoes, hailstorms, those are much more difficult and highly complex to figure out, and just do not have the level of agreement. When you look at wind direction, wind velocity, there's some models that are coming out there, but there's still a lot of work that has to be done there, because it's very difficult to even forecast wind out to a long period of time, much less look at the climate side. Solar irradiance, I think, is getting better, because it's dealing with temperature, and so you're looking at humidity factors and the like, and but those still are still being developed. After Winter Storm Uri, there was a lot of discussions about how climate impacted Winter Storm Uri, which was that major winter storm that came and knocked out Texas power for several days, so the Great Texas blackout. And so when you're looking at wavy jet streams, there is a relationship between a warmer Arctic and that's coming closer to temperature as far as North America there, for example. But as climate change leading to a higher likelihood of these polar vortexes, there's still a lot of discussion and debate as far as the direct impact of those wavy jet streams, and how much more likely we're going to see those types of polar vortex events there. But I don't know if anyone else has anything to add in that regard.
Dr. Liu, Dr. Shaddai?
So if I may just add one thing from the perspective of a scientist, I think companies need to be cautious of black box models. So you need to understand what's happening in the model simulation. What are the input data? What are their assumptions? Because your model output is just as good as your input and assumptions. And how robust and rigorous are these models? So, and another thing to be aware of is how they interpret their uncertainties, because every model has uncertainty. There are 3 types of uncertainties: the uncertainty from the input data, uncertainty from the model structure, and uncertainty of parameters. So all of those uncertainties could add up, and the result coming out of these models need to be carefully interpreted to consider these different uncertainties.
Excellent, thank you.
Good point.
And so what are the limitations with using downscale climate modeling?
You want to do that one, Lou?
Okay, yes, I can take that one. So I do my best. So first of all, downscale climate data are downscaled from global climate models that run at coarse spatial and temporal resolutions. There are many global climate models maintained by different research groups around the world. And scientists have been applying different downscaling technologies to bring the coarse resolution climate data to finer granularity. So first of all, keep in mind that these are model data. So meaning that the model that produced the data has been validated against observations, but the projected data still bears some level of uncertainty. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different sources of uncertainties. You need to be aware of that. And because of these uncertainties, so each global climate model will produce different climate projection. So when you look at the climate projection downscaled from these global climate models, you need to understand that this is not a prediction or a forecast of what the weather will be like tomorrow, but rather what's the Earth long-term climate pattern may look like in the next decade or so. So these data can tell you if the place is getting warmer or colder, is it getting drier or wetter, and is the temperature going to rise or fall on average? So these are the information that the downscale climate model can give you. It shows you a good perspective of future climate in a specific region over a certain time frame with some level of confidence.
And do we have someone else to that? No. Okay, superb. And what do you think asset owners are using now to address climate change risk, or are they even doing it?
Did you say asset owners?
Yes, asset owners.
I think it varies considerably across sector and industry. Some organizations are much more progressive in this space. Cities, for example, seem to be really tying into this. There's just been a lot of development of climate action plans, a lot of concerns around public health impacts, and just resilience planning. So, cities seem to be actually, in some regards, really focusing in this space and trying to get as much of this information as possible. We actually worked with Texas Tech University's Climate Sciences Center and Catherine Hayhoe over there to do a climate risk assessment for the city of Houston. And so using Texas Tech's downscaled climate data for the state of Texas, able to help the city of Houston better understand what that risk looks like. But when we talk, for example, I'm most familiar with the energy sector space. And as we talk to these organizations, they're not using this data. They're still using forecasted weather data. So essentially look at 20 years of historical data forecasted into the future and anticipate that the world stays the same. And we have a finance audience here, and we know that we don't do that with stocks. I'm not sure why we expect the weather to stay the same for 20 years as well. And so especially with global climate change, and so we do not see a lot of activity. We see a lot of growing discussions around it, especially when you focus on the transition risk. That's where a lot of the discussions are happening. What does that carbon tax environment looks like? What do the carbon trading opportunities look like? How do we deal with that decarbonization risk? But when you talk to them specifically about physical climate risk, it's still very much, we use weather data, and that's problematic at this time. And so there's a lot of education and information that has to be shared. And as Lou mentioned, there's a lot of work that has to be done to help people understand, what these different models look like. How do you interpret these results? How do you use this data to make appropriate decisions around that? You look at some of the logistics companies, they seem to be, especially those that are having significant impacts to their supply chains and have already seen significant disruptions, they seem more willing to kind of really look at this climate data. When you look at the agribusiness, food production, anything kind of on the ag side, they're a little more closer to the environment there, and you see a growing use of climate models in that sector. I think they're a little more advanced than some of the other sectors, but that's just a couple other examples. I'm, as I said, most familiar with the energy industry, especially the power side, and there has not been a lot of focus in this because in some regards, it's like we haven't been told to do it yet. We're waiting, kind of waiting to see what the environment looks like and how it's going to develop, what the regulatory market environment is going to look like. So,
thank you, Gavin.
Process. Yep.
You wanted to answer?
Yeah, the other thing is, if they're using historical models to predict the future, you've got over the last 5 years, you've had the highest temperatures, progressively, and so trying to base your forecast on past data is not going to quite cut it in terms of the temperature reaching higher and higher each summer, progressive summer. So that's a concerning thing, both, and that affects their capacity factors and their limitations on the regulatory side.
Thank you, Herman. Dr. Shaddai, if you have to describe the Wignite's services, can you tell us, what they are and how they address some of the issues that we've discussed today, and possibly some of the ones that we haven't?
So this is a very open-ended question. So let me tell you part of the part of the answer is decarbonization. And we have to find out, and I don't mean decarbonization by stopping oil and gas. I mean decarbonization by finding ways to capture the carbon dioxide that we are, emitting to the atmosphere. And in my opinion, the best way are the grow houses and forestation. What's being done in Washington State right now is actually an answer. The short-term answer is to make sure that we have enough water supply, and we have, the risks assessed on what is going to happen in the near future, and we try to mitigate those risks. And as we are working on those near future risks, we start working on the long-term risks, as was described by Gavin and Dr. Liu. And that is, in my opinion, the only way we can start working and mitigating from now. Tomorrow is late. Gavin, do you want to add anything else?
No, I thought that was well said. So nope, nothing to add.
Superb. And then so with regard to Pythias Analytics services, if you were to describe them, would it be scenario planning, predictive forecasting, or climate change forecasting, and why?
Right. So as Dr. Liu mentioned earlier, we're trying not to predict anything in this regard because the models aren't there yet for the predictive piece. But what we are trying to do is work with organizations to run scenarios. So providing robust climate data from a variety of climate models. So it's important you have a diversity of robust precipitation, temperature models that are out there. We also have the GCAM, the Global Climate Assessment Model, that allows us to look at a variety of factors: market, regulatory technology, physical climate risk changes, and impacts to the power systems. But largely it's to, first of all, set up, okay, so what does your climate risk look like? What have been some previous events that have had significant impacts on your plants? Are you most susceptible to drought or to flooding or to sea level rise or extreme heat? And then as we kind of set those parameters, what does the future look like? What do the climate risk indicators look like under those 4 different, say, climate risks there? And once we kind of have those climate risk indicators set up, we start looking at what are the scenarios that we start kind of going through a scenario planning process to where we start looking at, okay, these are your physical climate risks. And this is potentially, what we see happening on the regulatory side. This is what's happening on technology changes. This is what's happening on market. And how does that impact your decision making? How does that impact how you see the future? And based on how we see the future, what are the ideal ways, or how do we think about responding to that? How do you build that adaptive capacity to be prepared for those types of risks and have the right steps in place? And so essentially it's going from, developing those climate risk indicators, helping with the scenario planning, and then thinking about the different strategies to overcome those potential risks.
Fantastic.
I want to add that we can do that at the asset level and the portfolio level. And so essentially you can do the individual asset, what are the risks at that level, and then you can look at, you have 6 plants in different places in the United States. You can do an assessment at a portfolio level on what the risk factor for your portfolio. So it's very unique perspective that I've ever seen in terms of trying to help assess climate change for companies.
Fantastic. And I'm going to pull on some folks from the audience. So if you don't like being asked questions, well, I guess tough luck. Amy, Henry, Sharon, Rector, do you have any kind of points to add? I know we've got some experts in the audience, and I don't really want to I want this to be an interactive conversation. So if you can unmute yourself perhaps and add some further color to the conversation. If you don't want to, that's fine as well.
Well,
okay, great. Amy, fantastic.
Mark, I have to leave. It's very nice meeting everybody, and have a great day. And I'm looking forward to more conversations.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Superb. Amy, thank you for joining us. Appreciate that. If you can briefly introduce yourself and tell folks just a touch about your background and then add to the color of the conversation.
Okay, Amy Henry. I'm the CEO of Unique Ventures. So we're a hybrid, I'll say accelerator venture, and we work across the value chain. So some of our industry partners have been Equinor, Hess, Technip FMC, Anadarko. So we work in the technology space, and historically has been working with companies at the MVP stage, field trials and getting POCs, and working across the industry. How do we accelerate adoption of and commercialize technologies that they need? And part of that, of course, includes hydrogen, CCUS, electrification, all of these fun areas. My background, I'm ex-Shell Ventures, as well as Petronas. So I've worked historically in the technology space, from R&D and taking our technologies out of the lab. How do we scale it up? Why do we fail? Also was with unconventional when we first took that out of the labs. I think it was in the 90s, right? I have to say, I probably don't have a lot of color at this point, because we're having a lot of these conversations with our industry partners, right? And everyone is on a different journey, and everyone is looking at strategy and really, how are they going to, what kind of outcomes are they trying to achieve? And everyone's trying to determine what are their business models. And so these are the engagements that we're having right now. It's really just having, what I call good, big framing sessions, because, everyone's trying to figure out where are they going to play in this space, where will they end up having their new business models in these new energy markets and kind of circular economies, right? So, I mean, historically, people would expect the IOCs to have the answers, right? So we do a lot of conversation. I mean, we work internationally, right? So we work, with Canada Foresight. Canada Clean Tech is Canada's clean tech ecosystem cluster builder for clean tech. There are partners up in Canada. We have a small hub up there. We work with Business France. We work with Innovate Norway. We're getting more outreach from now Indonesia and Malaysia, right? Of really, wanting to focus on North America primarily, and all of the clean tech and new energy development. So, and of course, carbon credits are one of these questions that keep coming up, right? And as it relates to new technologies and development. So
fantastic.
These are early stages. So we would like to see more industry-led discussions on this, right? From industry kind of driving these discussions more. So
superb. And you have an event tomorrow, is that correct?
Yeah, it's tomorrow, and this is just kind of a trial run for us that we've kind of connected so that Canada would have a more streamlined, I'll call, process in global end-to-end from when they incubate and accelerate technologies. So the problem we see, and this is kind of some of the reason why Unique was done with Statoil in the early days, was the fact that early stage companies are out there trying to capture venture capital, right? But the problem is they need to be working with their customers on their technologies, explaining their business use case, their value proposition. If you have a pilot, what does a pilot look like? What are those dimensions? What do they need from industry? And part of this is to present to various industry players, kind of across the board. We're starting off a small group because it's like herding cats. So that early stage companies can get relevant and valid feedback from industry, right? As they go through their phase of technology development and then eventually commercialization.
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate that, and you definitely did add color. And so, folks, please reach out and connect with Amy so that you can, we can begin working together. Because if we're not connecting and we're working in silos, then we're not solving the issues. All right. So, who is the target market for climate change risk models? Is it generators, transmission companies, distribution companies, asset management? Gavin or Haman?
Well, the target market are utilities, IPPs, asset managers, and distribution and transmission companies overall, so they can, the transmission and distribution companies, just so they know what to expect from the generators in the deregulated marketplace. If they're utilities, they're usually all integrated, and so they know what the generation is. They just don't know the climate piece of it. So that's the target market.
Excellent. And what are the barriers to incorporating climate data in asset planning and strategy development?
Wow, that essentially trying to understand that that what they're doing currently using back data isn't going to help them in the future, and so trying to be more forward-looking, trying to focus on future data and doing risk scenarios to better inform decisions. So let's say you had an older combined cycle plant and the steam turbine needs work. Do you really want to invest in a new steam turbine if you're having water temperature issues, or if there's another way of would you want to put in a gas turbine instead of a steam turbine to make sure you get make your contract obligations because of water temperature? So those are the types of things that you would be able to consider. And the other thing, like we mentioned before, impairment is the other way that to use these consulting services to make sure that you are adequately putting in climate change risk into your evaluation of your assets on a quarterly basis.
So how is climate risk being considered in valuation of assets and companies and impairment of assets?
Not very well.
We're actually working on a paper on that right now for including climate risk indicators and discounted cash flow models. And so that's going to be, because that's one of the discussions we've been having with organizations that are looking at valuation, is, how do you start thinking about climate risk and as you value an organization, whether you're investing or divesting or whatever, an M&A firm, venture firm, what does that look like? And so we've partnered up with University of Houston to kind of walk through those steps, because we have ourselves as scientists, we have a lot of the climate risk indicators. We see what those risks are, but how do you translate into an impact on valuation, and how does that look like over time? So yeah, right now we're working and making sure that translation is better understood. There is some work that's being done. We can share the link of some papers that are out there that's looking at, what are specific indicators that need to be considered in valuation in an energy model. And Herman talked on some of those. And but there is some early stage work that's happening in that space, because that's an area that's growing of interest.
Superb.
Mark, I just like to just kind of throw my thoughts, because I mean, historically, right? I mean, for those of us in the industry, just the big issue is understanding the impairments, asset retirement obligations, right? And that still is problematic even on conventional energy assets as of today, right? Let alone then trying to layer on, or companies then trying to address climate on top of this. So I really do think this is a huge issue, right? If they don't have the foundational part done yet, and it's still being addressed in the industry, then how do you layer on? these climate impacts and modeling that they need to do.
And just sort of a thought from the cheap seats, if you will. Hi, Brian Wiley. I wish I'd worked in climate for 20 years. I have not worked in climate for 20 years. But having said exactly that, what you guys are presenting is very interesting and worthwhile and academically deep and rich. And the points after Mark's question at the end, well, how does this connect? How do we, to Amy's point, we're on different journeys. How do we sort of connect and understand what each other are doing? And I think it was Herman, pardon me, and Gavin presented examples that are accessible not just to your direct potential users of your information, like reinsurance companies and forecasters and all those people, but understandable to people a layer beyond that. And from a networking, social networking, business networking standpoint, it's really helpful to somebody like me if either in your anecdotal summaries or maybe as a bullet point at the bottom of each of your sets of your slide decks, you give an example of how something might be interesting to someone that is understandable to people a layer beyond the audience you're trying to address, so that people like me can come back, and if I happen to be talking to somebody who's looking at plant retirements, oh, you might want to consider water accessibility when you're looking at your possible impairment charges a few years out, that sort of thing, because otherwise the audience you're addressing is a lot narrower. And if you want to be able to bring in other people, you can use anecdotes and examples, just one or two of them, so that somebody like me can understand who I should be telling about this.
I appreciate that comment, and we're trying right now. You're catching us at version 2.0, and we're focused more on asset managers and power industry guys. But point well taken, and I hopefully with the verbiage around some of the things, some of the slides I had, where I brought in some practical examples of what's happened recently, has helped you that. But point well taken. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And folks, if you do have any other comments to add, this is an open forum. Please, don't be shy. And so how would you see incorporating some climate change risk models in integrated resource plans?
Well, we're about to find out. We have a call on that with one of our clients on the 2nd. But essentially, integrated plans are where essentially utilities have to present their plans for additions and subtractions of power assets for a certain region and get rate cased on that. And so using the climate change scenario, you can more precisely determine what the operating capacity is for each of the plants using climate data as well, and try to put a finer point on this kind of stuff. Gavin, do you want to pipe in?
Yeah, I mean, for the integrated resource planning, that's just going to be a very important piece, because we're trying. I mean, it goes to all types of just whatever the strategic planning efforts need to look like. And so, if it's integrated resource planning or some sort of other organizational strategy outlooks that are being developed, when you're looking out 5, 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years, not taking into account climate information, climate data. And in many cases, especially when you look at an integrated resource plan, you're taking out what was your weather data and you're putting in climate data. And I think where we are now, we essentially kind of work those side by side and see how they kind of look out, how they kind of shape out in the next few years, 2, 5, 10-year type periods, and kind of see how, which one is kind of giving us a better feel, a better idea of how things are working out in that regard. So it's not going to be I think we need to start moving away from using historical weather, or we definitely need to start moving away from using historical weather. But it also has to be a place to where we meet people where they are. How comfortable are they to start looking at climate data and putting aside something that they've been using for years for their resource planning. And so we want to make sure that that's kind of an iterative, step by step. We're bringing both,
and that's
introducing
why
climate, making sure people are comfortable with both sides.
And that's why Solomon's question about what our data sets are, those are our key transparent questions that we're ready to answer to make people more comfortable and ready to embrace climate instead of just weather.
Excellent, thank you. And we had a question from the audience. Let's see, Len, do you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question? In the meantime, how do you?
Yeah, no problem. I've just read a little bit about further use of nuclear energy down the road, and that might be kind of a result of your analysis and models. But is that something that's an indication that there will be a larger role for nuclear power going forward?
Well, I can answer that. I used to work in the nuclear industry. I actually think that the days of large nuclear in the United States are going by the wayside. So we're going to do more small modular reactors. They've got about 5 different designs that are being processed through the NRC. And then there's other stuff on nuclear reactors using molten lava and thorium. And so I think that and they don't have those reactors don't have the problem with the fuel storage that the uranium-based reactors do. And so I think that they're around the bend. I think nuclear, you're going to see more nuclear in the China space and India and maybe Turkey. You just saw the 4 nuclear reactors being put up in a UAE, and that took 13 years to do. I'm thinking that smaller reactors, and then that actually changes NRC's perspective too, trying to figure out what buffer space that you have to have for small nuclear reactors and stuff like that. But they should be able to figure it out, because we have nuclear submarines, and I don't know how much more confined spaces that you can have where that are critical in a submarine. So we got it can be done. It's just a matter of what regulatory mindsets are in the United States and elsewhere.
Excellent, thank you. And then what are the typical engagement periods to analysis and report for a company that has power facilities?
Gavin, why don't you answer that question?
Sure, happy to. It kind of depends on the extent of the portfolio that we're looking at. It would be from a 3 to 6 month type of, I think, engagement to kind of do that full assessment that Herman kind of showed the schematic earlier, where we kind of go through the whole process of looking at current plans, working through an interview process, assessing what some of the key issues are at this point, and then start looking at the climate risk indicators and start putting together a plan based on that, some scenarios based on that. So it's typically a 3 to 6 month engagement.
Okay, fantastic, superb. Okay, we're coming to 9 o'clock, and so I'm going to thank our speakers for joining us and sharing the information. If you can kindly share your information in the chat. If there's anyone that would like to speak up, or just let us know what it is that you're working on or network. It's been very difficult, obviously, to network due to COVID and in the Zoom format. I think people kind of close off a little bit more due to the format. And obviously, as you can see, I was trying to prod people to open up. The reason twice wise man, Homo sapiens sapiens, rose to the top of the food chain is because we connected, we communicated, et cetera, et cetera. So let's not allow some little bug to prevent us from doing that. And so anyone who would like to kind of unmute themselves and share what they're working on or connect with anyone, please feel free to do so.
And Mark, I have to jump. I have another meeting or another presentation, so I apologize.
No worries, of course. Like we expect.
everybody.
Okay, looks like no one's taking up the offer. All right, well, thank you for joining us. We have a special purpose acquisition company talk coming up on August the 5th. If you're interested in that, please go ahead and sign up. It's on the FENG website. I'll also be conducting a free session on August the 17th at NAPE, North American Petroleum Expo. We'll be featuring talks from BP Ventures, Shell, the Federal Reserve Bank. Dan Pickering will be on our panel. That will be an in-person event. I did share the information in the chat. If you are interested, please go ahead or go to the NAPE website, which is napeexpo.org, and you can go ahead and register for that. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you face to face in the near future. Have a great day. This is Mark Erabogbo, Chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Group with the FENG, Financial Executives Networking Group. Thank you.